Hey everyone. Um, First of all, thanks for all the well wishes and all that. Just trying to take it easy. Doctor said I'm gonna be just fine. It's just a thing that happens to people my age and like me. So, all is good here. Feeling better already, but gonna take it easy for a little while just to make sure that nothing bad comes from this. So hope you all are doing well. Had a great weekend. Talking about judges today. So I'm really kind of bummed that we didn't get to do this in person because I think the judges' activity is actually quite fun. Most people tend to really enjoy it. And part of it is because we're kind of dealing with these judge characters who are ambivalent. They're both good, they have these great qualities about them, but they're also bad in some ways. And we'll talk a lot about some of those traditions later on. But I hope you all enjoyed the literature, but a couple of things at the outset, right? This is quite different than the Book of Joshua. In the Book of Joshua, we had kind of a unified tradition about conquest. All the Israelites are together. And a lot of these judges' traditions, we're seeing things that are kind of regional. Conquest that sort of starts and has stops and has a little bit of a hiccup and then starts again and again and again. And these two traditions stand in a productive relationship to one another. Judges is a counter tradition to some of those problematic instances of violence that we were talking about. Now, it's not to say that the Book of Judges isn't violent. If any of you read any of it, you know that it was extremely violent. But they're different in a lot of ways. So the Book of Judges, as we know, is kind of this very unique collection of literature. And we've been talking a lot about, like in Genesis, those sagas, and then we also have, patriarchal traditions where it's just story, 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 story. But we also have other texts like the Joseph novella that have a fully developed plot. They're kind of self-enclosed in that regard. But the Book of Judges is one of these collections of stories. Now, we talked briefly about the Deuteronomistic history on Wednesday, I think that was. In this Deuteronomistic history, remember, it's this all the literature that goes from Deuteronomy to Second Kings. Judges is kind of a weird part of that. It doesn't showcase as much of that sort of Deuteronomistic ideology about land, temple, and sort of following these commands in order to get blessings. That one's in there a bit more, but the temple is kind of nowhere to be seen in the Book of Judges. So one of the ways we kind of approach this, in my view, is, and I'm going to share up a PowerPoint as well. I'm gonna have to scoot down. Let's see if I can get this to work too. Not from the beginning. We'll get back to all of that. Okay, one of the ways that we can see that there's some editorial activity going on is the fact that there's basically three accounts of Joshua's death. So we have this one from the book of Joshua itself. This is at the end of the conquest. Joshua dies. They bury him in his sort of territory. Makes sense. Now, then I think it's about 6 verses later, because there's a few other sort of notices at the end of Joshua. And we get this in Judges 1:1. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, who shall go up for us to fight against the Canaanites, to fight against them? And that's part of that sort of editorial linkage between what's just come before in Joshua and what you're about to read in Judges. Now, there's also a second account of Joshua's death in the book of Judges. And this is here in Judges 2. So there's all this stuff. Joshua dismissed the people, all that. He dies. And then there's this notice at the end that's quite important. It says, moreover, that whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. So this is that same sort of paradigm we saw in the wilderness generation. That generation, they don't want to conquer. They're scared that they're going to lose. So they have to wander the wilderness until they all die, and the next generation can come. Now, that generation is the Joshua conquering generation. And they seem to be pretty, fully sold on the idea that Yahweh is going to give them this land. And as you read the book of Judges, your individual judges and things like that, you would have noticed that perhaps these Israelites aren't quite as sold on that idea. So we've been talking a lot about monolatry, monotheism, polytheism, all of that. And at the start of the book of Judges, we get a text like this. So the whole generation gathered to their ancestors. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the people around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. In his anger, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. And this is part of the book of Judges, why I kind of don't enjoy reading it as a reader, from a readerly perspective. What I mean by that is not, from historical or scholarly. From a historical perspective, this stuff is amazing. In terms of trying to figure out the ideology of the Deuteronomists or lessons you can learn from this, the book of Judges is deep, is, perhaps a bad way of saying it, but there's just a lot of layers and a lot of different perspectives and things like that going on in the text. But from a readerly perspective, right here, what we get in this section is the whole book of Judges more or less sort of spoiled for you. This is like if you go into a movie and you figure out the plot twist like 10 minutes in. If you haven't seen The Sixth Sense, pause for about 10 seconds or mute for about 10 seconds and then come back later. But it's like if you're watching The Sixth Sense and you think, I bet Bruce Willis is a ghost. The movie's awful then, right? So in that sense, the idea is spoiled for you in advance. And this is sort of what's going to go on in the book of Judges. So at some point, the Israelites do evil. In this sense, this is worshiping the Baals or the Ashtaroths. And we'll talk about them in just a second. So they do evil. Yahweh gives them over into the hands of an oppressor, some sort, whether it's the Midianites, the Philistines, Amalekites, whoever. Israel cries out because of this oppression. And then Yahweh sends a deliverer. Israel ends up having rest. That is the whole book of Judges. All of these individual characters we have who are called judges are going to fulfill, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this sort of last function in the circle. They come, they're brought up as a deliverer for Israel. And then they give them rest, they deliver them from their oppressors. And eventually the Israelites do evil again in the eyes of Yahweh. So who are these gods that the Israelites are turning away from Yahweh to worship? We saw in that text the Baals and the Ashtoreths. Baal is a name that means Lord, technically, like in its literal sense. And it's sort of like that same distinction I had between Yahweh on the one hand and Elohim on the other. Yahweh is the personal name. Zach. Baal and Elohim are kind of like the honorific title, professor or something like that. So there's this distinction, but the Baals, whenever it comes in as plural, in the Hebrew, it's Baalim. This is a sort of generic title for a bunch of other deities that are sort of floating around in that region. So one that we'll meet in 2 Kings, if many of you know the Jezebel story, is a Baal of Tyre, which is a city up on the coast, whose name is Melkart, for example. Now, the Baal that we're going to be dealing with primarily, because we're doing this in relationship to Canaanite city-states, and Tyre is a Sidonian city-state. Don't worry, we'll come back to that in a couple classes. We're dealing with one whose name is Hadad. Hadad is a sort of upstart deity, and there's this tablet, this thing we're looking at here, this is a sort of Hadad myth that we have a lot of tablets of. Very popular literature from a city-state called Ugarit. That's up on the coast as well. I took a Ugaritic class whenever I was at Vanderbilt. It's a very closely related language to Hebrew. So like we didn't have a particularly Ugaritic grammar book. The professor, Dr. Annalisa Zonia, was basically like, you all know Hebrew, so you're going to be able to figure this out. It's kind of like the thing between, reading English from the 1800s to, literature from the 20th century. Yeah, they're related. Yeah, there's some weird slight differences, but more or less you can read it. And so in this Ugaritic myth, Hadad, who we're going to be seeing as Baal a lot of the time, is kind of tasked with overthrowing this god of the water named Yam, who is trying to become king of the gods. For whatever reason, this is what's supposed to be happening. Now, Baal, Hadad, ends up getting some sort of special weapons in order to defeat this deity. And he gets them from a god who's kind of like Hephaestus in the Greek pantheon, a craftsman in that sense. It's this guy up here, Kothar Ulkasis. Now, he gives him a hammer and a spear. Hammer is kind of a difficult term. It's like a war hammer, but also maybe it's an axe. We're a little unsure. And you can see that club style thing above here. And then on this edge of the stela, there's a spear. You can see it's pointing in here, out of which there is a plant growing. Now, this is important because after Hadad defeats this god Yam, he ends up having to sort of go to the underworld. The god of death called Mot basically says, you killed my brother, I think. I think Yam is a brother of Mot, or best friend. It doesn't really matter. At some point, Hadad has to go down. And when he's there, he sort of dies in terms of the narrative. But his sister eventually goes down, liberates him from the underworld, and he comes back. Now, this sort of myth is connected to the ancient people's experience of seasonal changes. Hadad is a storm god, and we've talked a little bit about how Yahweh, in a lot of ways, is also envisioned as a storm god. But in this part of the world, there's a period of early rains where you plant then, and there's a long period of hot, dry, droughty type weather where, it's the dog days of summer here in Tennessee where you might never imagine that it's going to be cool again. And that's sort of envisioned as the period in time when Hadad goes down to the underworld. Now he's rescued and comes back, and then in the sort of seasonal fluctuations, there's late season rains as well. So this has a point for our literature, and we'll see it when we come back to the Song of Deborah. But this is the kind of God that the Israelites are turning away from Yahweh. And, in that sense, this God has to be appealing in some sort of way. You don't just turn away for nothing. So in that sense, the understanding that Hadad, the Baals, they're gods of agriculture, makes a lot of sense with the position of the Israelites as, peasants, they're farmers. And this is part of the distinction between Yahweh as a historical God and a lot of these other polytheistic deities as sort of seasonal gods. And what I mean there is that the Baal myth of him going down to the underworld and coming back up explains the feeling of us going through these cycles over and over and over again. If you remember the Gezer calendar we talked about, that is sort of explained. Why do we have to live? It's so hard. Is explained by these stories. Now, Yahweh's quite different, right? And we get some of that. We get that in the theme about Yahweh being a creator God. But whenever we think about Yahweh the liberator, the Exodus story only happens once. It's not something that constantly happens over and over again. It's a story about, in that version of it, a thing that happens once and for all. Now, this is also some sort of background behind a question that's been asked in class before. The Israelites, don't they know that there's only one God? Why would they be tempted to turn away? In an anthropological perspective, your gods might change from time to time as your concerns change. So this is part of sort of the fancy, philosophical word for it is the phenomenology, which just means kind of like the lived experience, the perception of the phenomenology of the ancient Israelites and why they turn away from Yahweh from time to time. We see it as kind of, it doesn't make any sense to us because we know the whole story. In terms of the real flesh and blood Israelites who lived there, They didn't know that whole story, So just trying to give some body to why the Israelites constantly put themselves in this cycle of them doing evil and having to, sort of deal with oppression, have Israel cry out, and have a deliverer come and save them from everything that's been going on so far. Okay, so another thing about Judges is that, we have all these tiny little stories. And in Judges, we get sort of a very eclectic mix as well. So like we get traditions that are about a specific tribe, like this story about Dan, the tribe of Dan, and their movement from sort of more southern to the far north. We get some traditions about judges that are a single line, like this one about, I have it here as the tall tale about Shamgar. It's basically in the days of Shamgar, he killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. An ox goad is just a staff that you push oxen along with. But we also get other like smaller forms of literature like the riddle. So the group that read Samson, or if you read Samson's tradition on your own, there's this riddle in there, and we don't get a ton of those in the Hebrew Bible. This might be the only one. There's a few other things in Psalms and Proverbs that sometimes seem like they're riddles, but the riddle is a very ancient form of literature, and it's also what's called didactic literature. It's to help train you to think. So if you remember doing like books of mind teasers or stuff, way back in the day, where you're supposed to try and figure out this like logical pattern that's not quite apparent. There's a book of these that's been found from Egypt. I think it's from the New Kingdom. And it's just sort of a whole book. It's a thing about, leisure time, try and figure out if you can get the secret to the puzzle, so on and so forth, like that. So I have a bunch of these different styles of tales here. And the ones we're going to talk about in a bit more detail are, oh man, that's a shame. It's supposed to be Ehud, not Ehud. Ehud. We're going to talk about him. We're going to talk about Deborah, Jephthah, and Samson. We're also going to, at the end, get up to this sort of Levite's concubine story. That might be one that we revisit in person as well, because it's quite weird. So let's just kind of keep on rolling through it then. Okay, so this first judge that we meet, and it's not the very first one, that's a guy named Othniel. But one of the early ones we meet is this guy Ehud, and I have up there the left-handed. Now, we've talked a tiny little bit about translation, but I'm going to constantly bring it up whenever it's really important. Now, for this one with Ehud, what we have in this instance is that the translators have kind of diminished the literal Hebrew in order to give you something that makes sense to you, right? So translation is an art, not a science. And a lot of my, graduate school classes, and whenever I'm writing and reading, I'm reading from the Hebrew, but translation isn't something that's just like 1 + 1 = 2. It's just not that. It's an art, and it's something that you have to make lots of decisions about. And in this case, I don't think the translation is bad whatsoever. It's just pointing out to you that, you have to always make these decisions. So we have here the verse that I'm going to be talking about in 3:15. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. Now, I have the Hebrew down here. That doesn't mean anything to you, but just, showing my work, whatever. And what this literally means is that he is bound up in his right hand, which kind of seems to imply that Ehud might be disabled in some form or fashion. Now, most humans are right-handed, whether it's a social thing or a genetic thing, I don't know. The biology majors in the class perhaps know better than me. But, we just are. So left-handed people are different in some ways. And this characterization, this small little line about Ehud, is kind of the key to his whole story. So Ehud, basically what happens is there's this king Eglon, who's kind of portrayed as a megalomaniac. But one thing in his description that's given out is that he's very, very fat in that regard. It's not something that gets said very often in the Bible, but it is, so in that sense, it stands out. Now, Ehud is bringing tribute to King Eglon from the Israelites. Eglon is a Canaanite. So he's bringing them, and then he kind of, plays to Eglon's ego, and he says, hey, I have a secret message for you. Eglon, not wanting anyone else to hear, sends everybody out. And Ehud comes up to him, and he takes his sword, which is on the left side, which apparently he hasn't been searched for because, left-handed, what? That doesn't mean anything. There's nobody who's left-handed, all the swords are on the right side, so you can get it out quick or whatever. He takes out this sword, and he stabs the king in the stomach. Now, the verbiage that's going on in there is very sort of, I have it here as macabre, because it is kind of a dark humor in that sense. It uses some sort of sexual imagery. The sword goes into Eglon, then the sort of folds of all of his fat go over it, and he can't get it out, and that sort of thing. And it's also supposed to be humorous. It's also supposed to make the Canaanites look bad, right? It's a sort of dark polemic humor. Now, Ehud stabs him, and you think, oh, good for you, but you're going to be killed, right? You just assassinated the king in his palace. But he escapes because this king is up in his upper chambers, which is where toilets are usually. And his guards are on the outside like, man, this has been taking quite some time, but are we really going to risk, walking in on him while he's going to the bathroom? I don't think so. So they wait and they wait and they wait, and Ehud's able to escape in that sense. So the traditions in Judges are not what we'd expect, perhaps, of typical biblical literature. But this is in there. This is a story, and it's that mix of some sort of bodily violent images with some humor, with some poking fun at these Canaanites, so on and so forth, that really makes Judges the unique book that it is. Yeah. Okay, so that's Ehud, quite an interesting character. But one of the judges that you all read today is Deborah, the prophetess, right? So I'm going to bring up her tradition real fast. Now, there's two sections to Deborah's tradition as a judge. There's chapter 4, which is more narrative tradition. There's chapter 5, which is the Song of Deborah. We're going to talk about the Song of Deborah first. And that's because the Song of Deborah is probably the oldest piece of literature, the oldest tradition that we have in the entirety of the Old Testament. Now, how do scholars come up with that sort of justification? This is really, really old. Well, one thing is that we have a number of what are called hapax legomena, which are words that only show up one time, which is quite difficult to translate those. But the other thing is that the grammar is different. It's a bit more archaic. It doesn't, it flows, but it doesn't flow how we expect it to do, given all the other traditions we've read in the Hebrew Bible. So again, this is that same sort of thing about, if you read Shakespearean English, and you see it and you're like, yeah, I understand it, but it's different than how I'm used to, language flowing and things like that. Now, the second reason why it seems to be really, really old and well known is because there's this reference to Yahweh whenever Yahweh goes out from Seir. Now, Seir is a mountain, and it's in the land of Edom. We talked a little bit about Edom, but it's basically to the southeast of Israel. Now, the other mountains of God, we have Horeb, we have Sinai. Those are the same mountain, two names, but those are way down to the southwest. Those are in that Sinai Peninsula. Seir is very far away, and it would seem problematic for the Deuteronomists. Remember, these are the people who want one temple, one God, one land, one people, to allow this secondary tradition about there being another mountain of God to stay in. So that's another reason why scholars think it's really, really old and really, really well known, is that there's some presentations of Yahweh that are quite different in it, but that nonetheless continue to make it through into the final form of the text. Now, in this sense as well, whenever she's talking about in the song, Yahweh from Seir, there's a line, when you march out from Seir, The earth trembled and the heavens poured. The clouds indeed poured water. The mountains quaked before the Lord. Now, that's storm god imagery. So again, we have this connection of Yahweh as a storm god, very much present in Deborah's judge tradition. Okay, so that song, quite interesting. You could spend a whole class probably working through it. This is the second or third time we've already talked about it, but what's going on in Deborah's narrative tradition? So again, a couple interesting things about Deborah. Verse 4, Judges 4, it says, at that time, Deborah, a prophetess. Now, Deborah is one of 4 women in the Hebrew Bible who are called prophets, prophetess, and we'll be returning to all of them. But she is a judge who isn't exactly like all the rest of the judges. Now, when we hear the word judge, we think of a magistrate, someone who sits in a court on a bench, hears legal cases all day long, gives out judgments, so on and so forth, right? And that's not what the judge thing really means here in this book. It's a good word for it because the word shofet does mean to judge. Shafat is the verb to judge. But judges do a lot more as well. Now, in the case of Deborah, she does actually sort of fulfill that legal function of a judge. She sits between a palm between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country, and the Israelites come up to her for judgment. Now we will see another judge who does something very similar to this next class, a guy named Samuel. But yeah, so she's special in that regard. But her tradition also works a lot by this sort of playing on relationships between men and women. So Barak here, Barak is a name that means blessed. Barak is the sort of commander of the army of the Israelites. And there's a king, Yabin of Canaan, who is haranguing them. So Barak is going to start a war, try and fight him back and all that. But he goes to Deborah and says, I won't go without you. I need you. And this is after he's already been sort of commissioned to go and fight. Deborah hears this and says, all right, I understand, but just know this. If you make me come with you, the glory will not go to you, Barak. Sisera, we'll get to him in a second, will be delivered into the hands of a woman. And that's a lot of what's going on in Judges in these relationships between men and women. So who is this Sisera character? He's kind of like Barak in the sense that he is the commander of the armies for the Canaanites. And he's sort of running wild throughout the region. They go to fight and the Israelites end up starting to win. And Sisera sort of goes away, right? He runs away. That's what I mean by not goes away. He flees from the battle. And while he's fleeing, he comes across this tent of Jael, who is a Kenite, another tribal group, not a tribal group, a clan within Israel. And Jael comes out to meet him and she says, come on in, have no fear. It's all fine. She brings him in and, she gives him something to drink. She covers him with a rug. It's kind of a very sort of motherly image in that regard. Now he comes in, she gives him some milk and he basically says, if anybody comes, you never saw me, blah, blah, blah. And he ends up laying down and takes a nap, right? Now, what does Jael do? For you all who read this, but for you all who didn't, Jael takes a tent peg, goes up to Sisera's temple, and that's the end of Sisera right there. She drives a tent peg through his head and kills him. Barak comes and finds this, and essentially Deborah's role as a prophetess is confirmed because she said this whole thing about, Yahweh's going to deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So in that sense, Deborah's role is quite interesting. But this Jael story is the one that really sort of makes you raise your eyebrows whenever you're reading this chapter in Judges. Now, the last thing I have here on this PowerPoint is that at the end of Deborah's story, there's a line that says, the land had rest for 40 years. And then the next chapter starts. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian. So we get this linkage between the stories. So that story, that little line, those two sentences, connect the story of Deborah with the story of the next judge who's going to come, which is a fellow named Gideon. Now, Gideon's story is interesting, but in the effort to not make this such a tedious endeavor, we're going to move on to someone else. And that's Samson. Samson is one who you all probably know from, Bible school, Sunday school is what I meant, Bible study, things like that. Samson is this kind of rock star of a judge. Now, Samson's traditions start in Judges 13, I believe. Let's double check. Yeah. And when Samson's being born, his father, Manoah, they're having a bit of trouble having a kid. So at one point, an angel of the Lord comes to him and says, to his wife, that is, there's this whole funny thing about Manoah doesn't like believe his wife, and the angel has to come back and be like, oh, you idiot. Yes, it's going to happen that way, da da da. And what the angel tells them is that you're going to have a son, but he's going to be special and he needs to do special things. And what he's doing is something that we've seen in Numbers 6, the Nazirite vow. Now, this vow, we don't see many Nazirites in the Hebrew Bible itself, but it seems to be something that's generally understood to be voluntary. It's something that you do, you say you're going to do as part of your devotion to Yahweh. But there's three major components. One is no consumption of wine or really anything from the grapevine. The rabbis and Talmudic authorities debated, well, can you have other alcohol? What about beer? Things like that. But no consumption of wine is what's there in the Numbers text, and it's what's mentioned in Samson's tale. The other side of it is that you're not supposed to cut your hair. You're supposed to let it grow long. And the third is that you cannot touch a dead body. So we've talked about this defilement stuff before. If somebody dies, you have to bury them, right? You have to touch the dead body. Now, after you've done that, which is a good thing to do, you have to go sort of purify yourself for a week because you've been touching, life touching death. It's not supposed to happen. But the Nazirites aren't allowed to sort of do that. Whenever Samson's father dies, he can't be there to bury him in that regard. And it's part of that sort of withdrawal from society that gives the Nazirite vow its specialness. Now, why, not why, but the Nazirite vow is generally thought, like I said, to be something voluntary, a show of devotion to God. In the Numbers text, there's not really like a benefit to it. Like it says, if you do this, then I'm going to do, certain things for you. But in Samson's case, the Nazirite vow is portrayed as sort of the source of his superhuman strength. So if Samson was going to be known as anything for being a judge, it would be these feats of strength. It's kind of like the Hercules of the book of Judges, right? So one of the things that he does, he's Samson's kind of rash and hot-headed, and he also really likes women. So he tries to marry this Philistine woman. There's a bit of a problem with it. He storms off. The father of the person he was trying to marry ends up giving her to somebody else because he thought, well, you ran away. I didn't think you wanted to marry her. He gets upset about that. He goes down to another city, finds a jawbone, and decides to kill 1,000 people with it. Pretty impressive, right? Another one is, he goes to the city of Gaza at one point, and the Philistines think, oh, we've got him now. He goes in, he has sex with a prostitute, he's sleeping. They start to surround him and all of that, and he gets up and fights them off and then decides, you know what, I'm going to take your whole gate with me. So he takes these giant wood doors, beam and all, kind of has a humorous image of him putting it on his back and carrying it up the hill to Hebron. That's, not something that's really humanly possible, but Samson, because he's this Nazirite, is portrayed as having this strength that's beyond comprehension. And then the last one there being the destroying of the temple. So at some point, he marries this woman named Delilah. If you're keeping count, I think that's 3, maybe 4 people that he's married. And and he's married this woman named Delilah, and she is kind of mixed loyalties, to say the best about her. And she's trying to figure out what's the source of Samson's superhuman strength. He tells her a bunch of lies, and then eventually he tells her the truth. She shaves off his head. The Philistines imprison him, gouge his eyes out, and force him to sort of work in a mill all the time. Now, that image is supposed to invoke the sort of dehumanization of Samson, because the things that worked in mills usually were animals, donkeys. Donkeys would pull the millstone around in a circle. You don't need to know that much about mills, but they were animal powered. Now they're being Samson powered, if that makes sense. Now they're going to sacrifice to their god because they're thinking, haha, we've destroyed this Samson. He's been, harassing us for days and days and years and years and years. And so they bring him into the temple. It's called a house in the text, but it's a house of the god. They bring him in there. They're sort of having fun and all of that. But his hair's started to regrow just a little bit. What Samson does is he grabs the two pillars, remember that, pulls them out and brings everything down on all of those Philistines. A very sort of tragic end in that regard, but one that befits Samson's characterization as the judge who was stronger than everyone. Okay, and now it's time to talk about the tragic judge. Those of you who read the Jephthah group, or who were the Jephthah group and read it, you were probably like, what, why, what did he do? So we have it here. And this is another situation where translation the translators, by virtue of choosing this word that's bolded there, have limited the interpretive options for you. So the word is here, Jephthah's spirits come on him, all that. If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return victorious shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering. Now, whoever, we know that whenever you see the word whoever, you're referring to a person. But the word in Hebrew is this little word right here, which again, I know this doesn't mean anything to you, but I like to show it to you all. Asher. Now, Asher is a relative particle and a relative pronoun. It can mean who, what, when, where. It can't mean why. That's the only one it can't mean. It's a very, very flexible word. But it basically is a word that indicates that it is some sort of unknown relative thing that's being worked into the grammar of the sentence in that regard. So what it really technically literally says, maybe I should qualify that. What it could be interpreted as saying is, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, I will give as a burnt offering. Because if you all read the story, or if you all know the story, what ends up happening is that when Jephthah returns, his daughter comes out of the house first to greet him, singing songs and all of that. And he's like, oh, you've laid me low today, because he has to keep this vow to the Lord. So it's his daughter. So the end of that story is, the daughter is like, well, you have to keep your vow, but at least let me go up into the mountains to memorialize, my virginity. She's a young girl or something like that. And it's an origin, remember that term, etiology. It's an origin of a festival that the Israelites celebrate, where they, sort of, the daughters go up and they have this sort of female only space, which is quite interesting. That this festival is not really mentioned anywhere else that I can remember off the top of my head. So a small tradition, perhaps even localized to a specific geographic region. So that's the end of the story. Jephthah has to burn his daughter. Now, again, alarm bells might be going off on your head. Human sacrifice. Whoa, we're not supposed to do that. This is one of those traditions that seems to go against the law. But at the same time, there's also traditions in Leviticus. There's one line that says, if we remember the cherem from Joshua, those things that need to be destroyed, those things that are vowed to be destroyed. Any person who is cherem to the Lord must be destroyed. They cannot be redeemed. So while the text really doesn't want you to be sacrificing humans, there are these very kind of obscure traditions that seem to indicate that this was something that sometimes went on in the ancient world. Um, okay, but what I was trying to do, although we should mourn Jephthah's daughter, is sort of recuperate Jephthah's character on the basis of this translation. Um, and the reason that I think that, we can cut Jephthah some slack is because he probably thought that it was going to be an animal that came out of his house first. So this is a recreation of what an ancient Israelite house would have looked like. The humans live up here generally, and downstairs is sort of like your working space. Animals live in here. You can see a few over there. I'm not sure how well this will translate in the video. There's some little animals over there. This is a place for storing food. This is a place for processing food. And this is the door he's sort of talking about. Now, you can imagine who's going to come out of this when they hear somebody coming. It could be a sheep. Probably would be a sheep, right? Instead, it's Jephthah's daughter. Now, this is sort of top-down view of it. Little storage areas, the main floor. These are for pillars, supports to go up like that. But yeah, the fact that it should be an animal coming out might help us sort of recuperate Jephthah's character, because otherwise he kind of just seems like a fool. And that's part of what I'm talking about in these traditions with the judges, is that they don't always seem like the best people, but they're there and they fulfill a role in Israel's deliverance. Okay, so the last one we need to talk about, that I'm pretty sure I asked you all to read, everyone, is the end of the book of Judges. And this starts in Judges 19 and goes through Judges 22. Okay, so brief rundown of the story. There's a Levite. Remember, the Levites are the priests walking around, and he is traveling. And he has this person called a concubine. Now, we don't need to go into that, but it's some sort of marital relationship. And the concubine, for some reason or another, decides to go back to her father's house. The text leaves it very unclear, or it's very foggy, we could say. And the Levite decides, my wife leaving like that has besmirched my honor, and I'm going to go get her back. So he goes and gets her back. And eventually, whenever they're traveling back to the Levite's home, they stop in a city called Gibeah, which is a Benjaminite city. So it's an Israelite city. They actually say at one point, we're not going to stop in the Jebusite city because those are bad people. We need to stay with our kinsmen, which is supposed to set up some of the dramatic irony for what occurs next. So while they're in Gibeah, they're sitting in the town square. They're going to sleep outside. And some man passes by and says, no, don't do that. Please come stay with me. Please. He does. In the middle of the night, the citizens of the city of Gibeah start banging on the door saying, bring out the Levite. We want to rape him. And this is supposed to be reminiscent of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We want to, the old man and the Levite are like, I have this daughter and this concubine. You can take them. They say no. Eventually, the Levite shoves his concubine out the door. There's scenes of sexual violence. And in the morning time, the Levite comes outside, sees his concubine sort of dead. We don't really know, on the door threshold. He picks her up, puts her on the donkey, takes her home. And this is rather violent, cuts her into 12 pieces, and sends those to the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, what you're thinking is probably, what the hell? And you should be. What ends up occurring after he sends those out is that all the 12 tribes come back, and they sort of try and figure out what happened. And they realize that the Benjaminites have not shown the sort of hospitality, to put it lightly, that they should show to their fellow Israelites, right? So they all go to war. Benjamin's almost, sort of eradicated. There's some other interesting stuff that happens, with wife snatching and all of that. And we can talk about that later. If you have questions, leave them in the Google form and I will bring them up in the next video. But what I want to focus on instead is the politics of gender, shame, and honor that are at work in the book of Judges. So one tradition that we didn't read about this guy named Abimelech in Judges 9. He's running around doing stuff, and then he's trying to besiege the city And it says, but a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Immediately, he called to the young man who carried his armor and said to him, draw your sword and kill me, so people will not say about me, a woman killed him. Now, this is a scene that we see a couple times in the Hebrew Bible, but it's indicative of this notion about masculinity and the sort of superiority in a way of men to women, especially when it comes to things about warfare. The story about Jael and Sisera, where she drives the tent peg through his head, is supposed to be demeaning to Sisera in that sense. Haha, you got killed by a woman, whatever. It's the form of a grade school insult, but it's on a much, much higher register. And that's what's going on with the Levite as well. We've already talked about the one at the bottom, Deborah and Barak, where Barak is kind of scared. He needs Deborah, and he won't sort of trust in Yahweh to deliver the Israelites against the Canaanites. So, Deborah says, okay, well, the glory is going to go to a woman instead. Now, we don't always think about this, but in the book of Judges, these sorts of dynamics of shame and honor based on semi or pseudo-sexual gender difference, all of that sort of imbalance between men and women in society are constantly operating. And that's what's happening here in the story of the Levite's concubine. We read this, and I think most of us probably, if we're going to empathize with one person in the story, it's the poor concubine, right? She's treated as property in a lot of ways. But the real motivator, the thing that causes the plot to keep on moving, is this idea that the Levite has been dishonored. He is experiencing shame from all of this. And so he's experiencing shame, and that's why the story continues on intensifying, getting more and more serious and more dire. But there's also something else occurring right here at the end of the book of Judges. And I wish I had the text here, but I'll read it to you. Here in that, in the PowerPoint. But the start of the story begins in chapter 19. It says, in those days when there was no king in Israel. And this is something we haven't seen yet in the book of Judges. We've seen the same sort of formulaic phrases. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and Yahweh handed them over to that. In chapters 19 through 21, I think it's only 21. I said 22 earlier, but we get this reference to the fact that there is no king in Israel, is the sort of new frame for this tradition in particular. And it's different than the rest of the book of Judges, right? There's no judge involved. So it starts with that. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All this wild stuff happens. And then at the very end of it, in chapter 21-25, it says, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. So the culmination, this kind of climax of the book of Judges, is this brutal intra-Israelite scene of violence, just brutality, grotesqueness, the breakdown in a lot of ways of the tribal system, to the extent that it's kind of begging the question about maybe we need something different than judgeship. Maybe we need a king instead. And that's what we're going to get in the next couple books that we read. We're going to read the books of Samuel, where we read the book of sort of the greatest judge. So the thing about the activity is that you all are supposed to say why your judge is the best judge. And then whenever I'm in there, I get to say, you were all tricked. It's actually Samuel. We're going to read him next week. Samuel is sort of super judge in that regard. But so we've talked a lot about all this. And what you would have done in the class, we would have talked about these sort of 5 characteristics that make a judge a good judge. And one of them is military leadership, right? The military is everywhere in this book. Gideon and Jephthah, for example, they're generals in that regard. Another thing that makes a judge is superhuman feats. This guy Shamgar, who kills 600 Philistines with an ox goad, or Samson pulling down the temple, things like that. Now, we also had the sense of Deborah, who was holding court, judging cases. And also, I left it out here, but with Deborah being a prophetess, she's that connection between Yahweh and the people, right? And another aspect of her reign as a judge. One of the other things is gaining or regaining territory. This is Othniel. We didn't talk about him. It's a small little tradition. And then also, and perhaps the most important part of being a judge is delivering Israel from oppression. Now, Ehud assassinates this Canaanite king, with his left-handed sword and all that, which is great. But what does that really mean? It means no more taxes and tributes. It means that the Canaanite system breaks down for a long while. And that is sort of Ehud's grand gesture in the sort of scope of Israel's, needing judges and things like that. So I have no idea how long this has been. I was supposed to be less than 50 minutes, but it might be longer. This will be uploaded on YouTube. So if you find it better, whatever, watch it at double speed. I don't care. And I'm not going to be offended is what I mean. But the Book of Judges is this weird, diverse collection of literature that is doing two things primarily. One, showcasing this cycle of sin, oppression, crying out, deliverance. I know y'all didn't see that bottom one, but that cycle, that's a Deuteronomistic cycle, dealing with retribution theology. You're going to sin and I'm going to punish you. But if you repent, then I'm going to make things right. Yahweh being that person. And the second thing it's doing is it's sort of bridging the gap between the tribal period and the emergence of the monarchy. So the next section of texts that we're reading are the books of Samuel and the books of Kings. And those are the story essentially of how the monarchy comes about and the monarchy is destroyed. So we're going to talk a lot more about kings and timelines and all of that coming up soon. The book of Judges is this sort of middle episode between the conquest and the monarchy. So I hope you all enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please, you can just send me an email too. If you don't use the Google form, I just, I don't got anything else to do, so maybe I'll make it. But I hope you all are doing well, and we will see you on hopefully Friday. We'll be back in the classroom. I'll keep you all up to date on that. But I will see you on Wednesday with another video about the books of Samuel. Thanks. Have a great day.